A young mechanic thought she was just scavenging along the coast of Maine. But what she stumbled upon would change her life and rewrite forgotten history. Half buried in the sand, hidden for nearly 80 years, lay a forgotten World War II warship. At first, it looked like nothing more than rusted steel, but inside, she discovered something no one was ever meant to find. A secret journal, classified ledgers, and a voice from the past, a sailor who had vanished without a trace. This is the story of Scarlett Rhodes, the mechanic girl who discovered a forgotten warship. And what she found inside shocked the world. But before we dive in, tell us where are you watching from? We love seeing our global family in the comments. Let's get started. The silence in Scarlett Rhodes' world wasn't just emotional, it was mechanical. Her little workshop in coastal Maine, once alive with the hum of engines and the smell of gasoline, now echoed like a tomb. Wrenches clattered, drills whined, but there was no music in the sound anymore, only emptiness. At 33, Scarlett wasn't just a mechanic. She was born with steel in her hands and stubbornness in her veins. She had rebuilt tractors before she could drive and tuned boat engines while other kids were still learning multiplication tables. But when the shipyard down the road closed, the town's lifeline snapped. Jobs vanished. Bills mounted, and Scarlett, for all her grit, was left patching together scraps just to keep the lights on. To survive. She had taken to wandering the wind-swept edges of the coast, scavenging rusted chains, copper wire, and forgotten tools washed ashore. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept food on the table for her and her loyal shepherd. Rocky, a scrappy dog with a scarred ear and a heart bigger than the sea. One cold morning, as gulls screamed overhead and the tide whispered against the rocks, Rocky froze. His tail stiffened, ears locked on something buried in seaweed and sand. Scarlett followed his gaze, her boots crunching on the gravel shore. Half buried beneath decades of barnacles and salt, a massive shape rose from the tide pool like a sleeping ghost. Her breath caught. With trembling hands, she brushed away the kelp and brine. It wasn't driftwood. It wasn't a wrecked fishing boat. It was steel, heavy, scarred, and unmistakably military. The bow of a forgotten Outpuaifuao patrol craft, wedged into the rocky cove as if the sea itself had hidden it away. Her fingers traced the corroded metal until they landed on a faded hull number. Scarlett didn't know it yet, but those numbers would open a door into the past, unlocking the legacy of a sailor who never came home. And a story the ocean had been guarding for more than 70 years. Scarlett Rhodes stood frozen, her gloved hand resting against the corroded steel of the patrol craft. The late afternoon sun dipped lower, pouring golden light over the cove. Waves slapped against the hull with a rhythm that sounded less like the sea, and more like the slow beating of a heart. She wasn't just looking at a wreck. She was staring at a memory that didn't belong to her, waiting to be remembered. The vessel was wedged into the rocks, half swallowed by the ocean floor, as though time itself had tried to bury it. Barnacles clung to its seams like stubborn scars, and seaweed draped over the railings like forgotten banners. Scarlett took nearly an hour, with Rocky nudging her elbow and whining softly, to clear enough debris from the faded paint to see the hull number etched faintly into the steel. She wiped the grime away with the edge of her jacket sleeve. PC 37. She didn't know why, but the number burned into her mind. Mechanics weren't sentimental by trade, they were curious, and this wreck stirred a curiosity deep in her bones. That night, Scarlett sat hunched over her old laptop at the kitchen table. The screen cracked, the Wi-Fi sluggish. A chipped mug of instant coffee steamed beside her while Rocky lay curled at her feet, snoring softly. She typed the hull number into every naval registry she could find. At first, nothing. Just blank searches, dead ends, and long-forgotten links. But then one hit. Patrol Craft 1137, commissioned 1943, assigned to the Pacific Theater. Last recorded Captain Lieutenant Samuel Blake, U.S. Navy. Final entry lost at sea, presumed sunk, 1945. And then, nothing. No recovery report, no wreckage identified, just silence. Scarlett leaned back in her chair, heart thudding against her ribs. Her eyes stung, though she couldn't tell if it was from the glow of the screen or from the weight of what she had uncovered. She reached down, absently rubbing Rocky's fur, as if grounding herself to the present. Why here, she whispered. Why now? The next morning, armed with tools, bolt cutters, a crowbar, and her stubborn will, Scarlett returned to the cove. The tide had shifted, lowering just enough for her to step onto the deck with care. The air smelled of salt and rust. Her boots echoed against the metal floor. The ship groaned beneath her weight, but it held. She started with the cabin. The door was rusted shut, but years of coaxing engines back to life had taught Scarlett patience. She pried at the hinges, hammered gently, then leaned her shoulder against the frame until it finally gave way with a groan that echoed into the silence of the empty shore. Inside, the air was damp, heavy with the scent of mildew and old secrets. Broken instruments lined the walls, their glass faces cracked, their needles frozen mid-measure. Maps lay tattered across the floor, ink smeared and faded by time. And in the corner bolted to the bulkhead was a sealed Navy ammunition crate. Scarlett froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The box was government green, its paint chipped but unmistakable. It had no markings, no labels, just welded seams that shimmered faintly in the dim light. Her fingers trembled as she reached out. The metal was cold. Too cold. It took her nearly an hour to pry it loose. By the time she wrestled it into her truck, her arms ached. Her clothes were damp with salt water, and her heart raced like an engine pushed too hard. Back at her workshop, she laid the crate on her workbench beneath the flickering fluorescent bulb. The room felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Rocky sat by her side, ears perked, watching. Scarlett pulled on her goggles, fired up her grinder, and let the sparks fly. The scream of steel filled the night, shattering the quiet of her little garage. It took nearly 40 minutes to cut through the welds. Sweat dripped down her temples, her arms shook, but she pressed on. Finally, the last seam gave way. She braced herself for the weight of weapons, or perhaps bundles of long-forgotten cash. Something valuable, something dangerous. But it wasn't that. Inside was a book, leather-bound, wrapped in oilcloth, old but astonishingly well-preserved. Scarlett's knees nearly gave out as she sat heavily on her stool, staring at it. Her hands trembled as she pulled the book free, brushing dust and flakes of salt from its cover. She untied the cloth with careful fingers, as though unwrapping something sacred. The first page stopped her cold. Property of Lieutenant Samuel Blake, U.S. Navy. Her throat tightened. The words swam in her vision as tears stung her eyes. She turned the pages carefully, each one filled with neat handwriting at first precise, measured, like a sailor keeping his log, coordinates, ship movements, names of crew. But halfway through, the handwriting changed, became rushed, uneven, desperate. The entries shifted from routine logs to warnings, Notes about a private contractor, Harbor and Crown Logistics, tasked with moving decommissioned naval equipment. Mentions of shipments that never matched their manifests. Supplies that vanished without record. Fuel invoices that couldn't be traced. And then, darker suspicions. Words scrawled with urgency. They're stealing from the dead. They're burying us in silence. I've seen the ledgers. They're hiding something big. Too big. If I don't make it, don't trust command. Don't go through channels. They're already compromised. I had to hide the proof. The ship carries more than it should. It carries the truth. Scarlett slammed the book shut, her breath ragged. Rocky whined, nudging her knee. This wasn't about a forgotten wreck anymore. It was about a man who had known too much. A sailor who tried to speak the truth, and whose voice had been swallowed by the ocean. And now by chance, fate. Or maybe something more that truth had washed up into Scarlett Rhodes's hands. She leaned back against the wall of her garage, the weight of the journal heavy in her lap. She closed her eyes, hearing not the hum of an engine, but the ghost of a voice carried by the waves. Some stories don't stay buried, and this one had chosen her. Scarlett Rhodes didn't sleep that night. The journal sat open on her kitchen table, its yellowed pages weighed down by a half-drunk cup of coffee. The words seemed too heavy for one person to carry. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't an investigator. She was just a mechanic, a woman trying to keep her head above water in a world that hadn't been kind. And yet, somehow, this had landed in her lap. No, she realized it hadn't just landed there. It had found her. By morning, the decision was made. Scarlett loaded her tool bag and a shovel into the bed of her old Chevy, Rocky hopping into the passenger seat before she could protest. The tide was low when she arrived at the cove, the warship's rusted bow rising like a tombstone from the water. Scarlett's boots crunched against wet stones as she climbed back aboard. She wasn't just exploring anymore. She was searching. She remembered Blake's final warning in the journal. The ship carries more than it should. It carries the truth. She slid beneath the corroded deck plates, her flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. Rust flaked down like ash as she worked her way toward the stern. And then, she saw it barely visible beneath grime and seaweed, a false panel, bolted into the steel frame near the engine room. Her breath caught. With slow, steady hands, she set to work. Wrench, crowbar. The sound of bolts giving way echoed like gunfire inside the hollow hull. Finally, with one last twist, the panel dropped to the floor with a dull, metallic thud. Behind it sat a watertight steel container, smaller than a toolbox, heavier than it looked. Her pulse quickened as she dragged it free, cradling it like a relic as she climbed back onto the deck. Back at the garage, the container sat on her workbench, its presence filling the room with a weight no engine or gearbox ever had. Rocky sat at her feet, whining softly, as if he sensed the gravity of the moment. Scarlett pried it open with trembling fingers. Inside were not weapons, not gold, not valuables at all. It was worse. Neatly stacked inside were original Navy ledgers, sealed in protective wrapping. The documents were stamped, signed, untouched by time. Scarlett flipped through them, her breath growing shallower with every page. Shipment after shipment. Equipment transfers that never matched the logs. Fuel tallies for ships that didn't exist. Spare parts for vessels long decommissioned. The records told a story of theft, corruption, and betrayal buried beneath the fog of war. And then her hands froze. At the back of the container lay a smaller envelope. Inside, tucked carefully between brittle sheets of paper, was a reel-to-reel audio tape, its label scrawled in shaky handwriting. Play only if you trust no one. Scarlett's heart slammed against her ribs. She hadn't seen a tape like this since childhood. She didn't even own a player anymore, but her late grandfather had kept an old reel-to-reel recorder in the attic. She remembered dusting it off as a girl, pretending it was a radio sending secret messages. She retrieved it, cleaned the dust from its dials, and fed the tape onto the reels. The machine groaned to life, filling the room with a low hiss. Then a voice, hoarse, southern, steady, filled the garage. If you're hearing this, it means I didn't make it. My name is Lieutenant Samuel Blake, United States Navy. What you're holding is proof, real proof, that the wrong people were given too much power, and no one stopped them. Harbor and Crown wasn't just a logistics firm. They were stealing, hiding, using names of the missing to cover their tracks. There was a pause. Scarlett could almost hear the man breathing through the static. I dug too deep, I saw too much, and I knew they wouldn't let me live to tell it. This ship, this journal, these ledgers, it's all I had left to fight them. So I hid it here, far from prying eyes. Maybe one day. Someone would find it. Someone who'd care enough to finish what I couldn't. The voice cracked then, the mask of a soldier slipping into something softer. To whoever you are, if you're listening, I'm sorry. Sorry for what this will cost you. But don't let them bury the truth. Don't let my men disappear into silence. Carry it forward. Promise me that. The tape clicked, then nothing but static. Scarlett sat frozen, the sound of her own ragged breathing filling the garage. Rocky pressed against her leg, tail tucked, as if even he understood the weight of the words that had just reached across 70 years of silence. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead to her grease-stained hands. She hadn't asked for this. She wasn't looking for it. And yet, here it was passed to her like a torch, burning and impossible to put down. Later that evening, needing answers, Scarlett drove to the town library. She combed through dusty microfilm reels, the old projector flickering headlines from a war long past. It took her hours, but finally there it was. A small article, buried deep in the archives. Local officer lost at sea, Lt. Samuel Blake declared missing. Just a single paragraph, just one faded photograph. A young man with steady eyes and a crooked smile. Scarlett reached out, tracing his face on the glass projection screen. He had never come home. But his ship had, and his voice, buried for decades, was now alive in her garage. Scarlett leaned back, her chest tight with grief for a man she had never met. She knew one thing with piercing clarity: someone had tried very hard to bury this story. And if they learned she had it now, they would come looking. That night, as the coastal wind howled outside her small house, Scarlett sat at her workbench, the journal, ledgers, and tape recorder spread out before her like sacred relics. And outside, headlights swept slowly across her front yard. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. The car didn't stop, didn't honk, just circled, watching. Rocky growled low, his hackles raised. And for the first time, Scarlett Rhodes wasn't just afraid for herself. She was afraid for the truth. Scarlett Rhodes barely slept. The weight of the journal, the ledgers, and Blake's voice still lingered in her small garage, pressing down on her like the tide before a storm. She sat in the dark, staring at the faded photograph she had found at the library, the young man with the crooked grin, frozen in time. He had died carrying secrets, but he hadn't meant for those secrets to die with him. He had buried them, hidden them, prayed that someday someone would find them. And now, that someone was her. The next morning, Scarlett tried to force herself into routine, sweeping the porch, checking the mail, pouring lukewarm coffee into her chipped mug. But the world no longer felt solid. The truth had cracked the foundation of her quiet life. Every sound carried weight. Every shadow seemed sharper. When she drove into town for groceries, she noticed it immediately, the same black sedan parked across from the diner. 2 men inside, suits, sunglasses, pretending not to look her way. They weren't pretending well. Scarlett's fingers tightened around the steering wheel, her heart drumming a rhythm of quiet defiance. Whoever they weren't just there to watch. They were there to silence. For a moment, she thought about pulling into the sheriff's office, walking straight up to the desk, and handing everything over. But then Blake's words burned in her ears. Don't trust command, don't go through channels. They're already compromised. No. The truth had chosen her, and she would not hand it back to the very people who wanted it buried. That evening, she loaded the journal, the ledgers, and the tape into a canvas bag, then drove out past the edge of town, past the gas stations, the shuttered shipyard, and the weathered church steeple that had watched over her since childhood. She didn't stop until she reached her grandfather's old cabin, hidden deep among the pine trees near the ridge. The cabin was little more than a skeleton, now sagging roof, broken windows, no electricity. But to Scarlett, it was the one place no one thought to look. She sat on the porch steps as the sun dipped low, orange light bleeding through the branches. Rocky leaned against her leg, his warmth grounding her. Scarlett pulled out the journal, thumbing through Blake's frantic scrawl. Her grandfather used to say that truth was like an old engine. It sputters, stalls, and resists. But if you're patient, if you know where to look, it always turns over. She understood that now. All her life. Scarlett had believed stories like this belonged to other people. Soldiers with medals, reporters in suits, senators behind podiums. Not mechanics. Not women who scraped by fixing carburetors and patching rusted hulls. But the wreck had found her. Blake's words had found her. His voice had found her. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't chance. Maybe it was faith. Scarlett stared down at her hands, grease-stained, rough, steady. Maybe she was the one meant to carry this torch. When she returned home, her resolve had hardened. She began scanning every page of the journal, photographing every ledger, and copying files onto flash drives. She made 3 backups, one she hid inside her old toolbox, another uploaded to a cloud account under a false name, and a third printed, wrapped in plastic, and buried inside a coffee can behind her shed. If they came for her, they wouldn't just find silence, they would find proof. That night, the black sedan was back, parked closer this time, its headlights off, engine quiet, waiting. Scarlett didn't flinch. She sat in her garage, the hum of her desk lamp illuminating the pages spread before her. Rocky rested at her feet, his ears alert, his body taut like a sentry carved from muscle and bone. Scarlett picked up a rusted bolt from her workbench, rolling it between her fingers, listening to the subtle scrape of steel on skin. She wasn't the same woman she had been a week ago. Something inside her had shifted. She was no longer just a mechanic trying to survive. She was a keeper of a sailor's truth, a witness to corruption buried beneath decades of silence. A fighter in a battle she had never asked for but could no longer ignore. Her fear had burned away, leaving something sharper, heavier. Resolve. Scarlett Rhodes was not going to run. She was going to fight with the only weapons she had, truth, persistence, and the courage of a man who had spoken from beyond the grave. And when the day came that they knocked on her door, demanding her silence, she would be ready? It began with a single name. Scarlett Rhodes sat cross-legged on the cold concrete floor of her garage, the ledgers spread out around her like fallen leaves. She scribbled on a yellow notepad, typing each name from Blake's lists into her battered laptop. Most searches ended the same way: MIA. Presumed dead. No further record. But then one name lit up the screen. Frank Delaney. Retired. Navy. Survived 2 tours in the Pacific. Last known residence, Wilmington, North Carolina. Scarlett's heart stuttered. She rifled back through Blake's journal. There it was in hurried scrawl next to Delaney's name. Only man left I trust. Knew about Harbor and Crown. Still has copies. Her breath caught. Could it be possible? After all these decades, one of Blake's comrades was still alive. That was enough. The next morning, Scarlett loaded her truck. She packed the journal, the ledgers, the tape, every shred of truth she had. And Rocky, stubborn as ever, leapt into the cab before she could even close the door. 2 hours later, Scarlett pulled up in front of a small brick home, tucked behind a leaning mailbox and an overgrown yard. An old Navy flag hung limp on the porch, weathered by sun and years of wind. She climbed the steps, clutching Blake's journal to her chest. Her hand shook as she knocked. The door creaked open. A tall man with sunken eyes and white hair stood before her. He wore a faded flannel shirt and a look that said visitors were rare. Scarlett swallowed hard. "Mr. Delaney. My name is Scarlett Rhodes. I think you knew him." She held out the journal. His gaze dropped to the name inside. Samuel Blake. Something in the old man broke. His shoulders sagged. His eyes filled with water he hadn't shed in decades. He took the book with trembling hands and pressed it to his chest like he was holding a long-lost brother. "My God!" His voice cracked. "You found him!" They sat together on the porch for hours. The air smelled of pine and salt, but the silence between them was heavier than any storm. Finally, Frank spoke his words, slow, brittle with memory. "He was the best of us," Frank whispered. "Brave. Too brave. We all knew Harbor and Crown was crooked supplies disappearing, papers forged. But Sam, he tracked everything. Every gallon of fuel, every spare part, every name of the boys who never came home. He swore he'd bring it to light." Frank's hands shook as he opened the ledgers Scarlett had brought. His face, lined with age and grief, twisted as he saw the signatures, the stamps, the lies made permanent in ink. This is what they killed him for. His voice broke, a tear cutting down his weathered cheek. "All these years, I thought his fight died with him. And now you—" He looked at Scarlett, his voice faltering. "You carried it back." Scarlett felt tears sting her eyes. She wasn't just carrying history, she was carrying grief, decades old, still raw. Frank disappeared into the house and returned with a wooden box. Inside were brittle letters, faded photographs, and a cassette of his own. He placed them gently into Scarlett's hands. "I kept these, waiting for someone to believe me, but nobody ever did. Until now." Scarlett nodded, her throat tight. She felt the weight of generations in her hands. Together, they called one of Frank's old contacts a retired colonel turned whistleblower advocate, a man who owed Blake his life. And just like that, a door cracked open. Within a week, Scarlett found herself in a dimly lit room at the back of a veterans' hall. Around a folding table sat Frank, Scarlett, and 5 others, men and women who had lived long enough to see too much, and who had carried their silence like a wound. The journal was passed from hand to hand, the ledgers, the tape. They listened to Blake's voice. They saw the names. They read the lies made visible. When the room finally fell silent, one man, his hair silver, his voice hoarse, whispered, He never stopped fighting, did he? Scarlett shook her head, tears spilling over. No, but they buried him before he could finish. The eldest among them, a former intelligence officer with trembling hands, reached across the table and gripped Scarlett's fingers. His eyes glistened with a resolve that age had not stolen. Then I guess it's our turn now. Scarlett's chest tightened, a sob breaking free before she could stop it. For the first time since this began, she didn't feel alone. She wasn't a mechanic stumbling into a fight too big for her. She was part of something larger, a chorus of voices long silenced, now rising together. When she returned home that night, the black sedan was gone. The yard was quiet. Scarlett stood in her driveway, Rocky by her side, her gaze on the stars above the coastal ridge. The weight hadn't disappeared, but something new had settled in its place. Hope? For the first time. She realized this wasn't just her burden anymore. It was a movement, a reckoning, and maybe the world was finally ready to listen. The old Scarlett Rhodes would have stayed quiet. She would have fixed the boat engines that nobody else could repair, patched rusted hulls, and kept her head down. She would have pretended that a voice from 70 years ago had never echoed through her garage. But that Scarlett was gone. The woman who stood in her place carried something heavier than steel and salt water. She carried the truth like a wrench slung in her tool belt, necessary and impossible to put down. Her garage no longer looked like a mechanic's shop. It had become a war room. Maps and printouts lined the walls. Ledgers lay spread across her workbench, pages pinned to corkboards with names circled in red. The patrolcraft's journal sat in the center of it all like a compass, its worn leather cover guiding her every step. In the yard, the half-buried warship had been towed onto a trailer, washed free of decades of seaweed and barnacles. Scarlett hadn't restored it, not yet. Somehow, it felt sacred, like a memorial. She could almost hear Blake's voice in the creak of its steel. Scarlett began recording everything. She filmed video logs on a cheap camera, her voice steady but her eyes burning with emotion. She scanned every document and stored them on encrypted drives. She even recorded herself telling Blake's story in her own words, her voice trembling as she said, "I didn't know him, but I know what he stood for, and I won't let them erase that." She wasn't hiding anymore. But the more she spoke, the faster the shadows moved. The threats started quietly, anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night, emails filled with warnings. Then came the sabotage bolts loosened on the trailer carrying the warship, locks on her garage broken. Someone wanted the past gone. Someone wanted her silence. Scarlett responded the only way she knew how, with grit. She reinforced her doors, installed cameras, and kept her shotgun propped behind the workbench. Rocky never left her side, his low growl a constant reminder that danger wasn't far. Each threat only confirmed what she already knew. The truth mattered. And the world was finally beginning to notice. It started small, an article on a veteran's blog, a rumor whispered across online forums. Then a YouTube channel run by old Navy men picked up the story, "Local mechanic claims to uncover Waitutur secrets buried in shipwreck." Most people dismissed it, but some didn't. Scarlett ignored the vultures, the reporters who only wanted headlines. But when a retired investigative journalist named Marjorie Sloan, once with The Atlantic, asked to meet, Scarlett agreed. They met in the back booth of a truck stop diner, the kind where the coffee tasted like burnt metal and the air smelled of diesel. Scarlett slid the journal, the ledgers, and a copy of the tape across the table. Marjorie read in silence, her pen barely moving. She didn't ask for drama. She didn't interrupt. She just listened. When Scarlett finished, Marjorie set her glasses down and asked one question. Are you ready for what comes next? Scarlett's voice was quiet, but firm. I have to be. 3 weeks later, the article hit the web. Buried Steel, the Mechanic, the Warship, and the Sailor America Forgot. It was raw, it was damning, and it spread like wildfire. By morning, Scarlett's phone wouldn't stop ringing. National outlets called. Journalists camped outside her driveway. But she turned almost all of them away. She didn't need noise. She needed truth. What mattered most weren't the headlines. It was the letters. Handwritten notes began arriving by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Families who had lost loved ones to paperwork errors, veterans who had carried suspicions for years, ordinary people who had never dared to speak. One letter, written in shaky script, simply read, "Thank you for digging him out. You gave my father his name back." Scarlett pressed that note to her chest, tears running hot down her cheeks. She hadn't saved the world. She hadn't brought every soldier home. But she had brought one name out of the dark. And sometimes that was enough to heal more than she could ever know. She began walking differently after that. Taller, firmer. She didn't smile much. But when she did, it wasn't fleeting, it was real. The fear hadn't vanished, but it no longer defined her. Purpose had taken its place. Sometimes, late at night, Scarlett would sit beside the Warship in her yard. The moonlight painted its steel silver, and Rocky would curl at her feet, his breathing slow and steady. She would place her palm on the faded hull and whisper, "We're getting there. Sam, I promise." And maybe somewhere beyond the veil, a sailor with a crooked smile heard her. Maybe he knew his story hadn't died with him. It lived on in a mechanic who refused to be silent, and in a warship that still seemed to be waiting for the key to turn. It wasn't the headlines that changed everything. It wasn't even the congressional hearings or the storm of interviews. It was the ceremony. 6 months after the story exploded across the nation, Scarlett Rhodes found herself standing in the back of a quiet chapel in Arlington. Her boots, polished for the first time in years, clicked softly against the marble floor. At the front of the room, draped in silence and sunlight, stood a folded American flag atop a wooden table. Beside it, a black and white photograph of a young sailor with a crooked grin and eyes far too old for his age. Lieutenant Samuel Blake, lost at sea, forgotten for nearly 8 decades. Finally, remembered. A Navy admiral in full dress uniform stepped to the podium. His voice carried through the chapel with solemn weight. He spoke of service, of sacrifice, of truth delayed but never destroyed. And then he read directly from Blake's journal the desperate words of a man who had chosen truth over safety, justice over silence. Scarlett stood in the back, her hands clenched, her throat tight. She had told herself she wouldn't cry. But as those words filled the room, her eyes blurred. When the ceremony ended, the admiral approached her directly. He stood tall, his chest heavy with medals, but his eyes soft. He saluted. "Because of you." "Ma'am," he said quietly. He came home. Scarlett could only nod, unable to force words through the knot in her throat. Then the admiral lifted the folded flag from the table and placed it in her arms. His mother passed in 1974, he said gently. There is no one left in his family to receive this, except you. Scarlett's knees nearly buckled under the weight of the cloth. She pressed it against her chest, tears slipping down her face. Her voice cracked to a whisper. "I'll keep it. He deserves at least that much." Back home in coastal Maine, spring had arrived. The pine trees wore new needles, and the sea breeze smelled of salt and thawed earth. In her garage, the warship's wheel and nameplate now sat polished and framed. The patrol craft itself, though scarred, had been carefully restored to a state of dignity. Its steel gleamed with fresh paint, its deck cleared of weeds and rot. Not showroom perfect, but honest. A survivor. Like its captain. On the dash of her workbench sat Blake's dog tags, framed beneath the hull number she had first uncovered in the cove. And above it all, encased in glass, the folded flag. Sacred, untouchable, home. People began to visit not out of curiosity, but reverence. Veterans, historians, students, families of the missing. They asked to see the journal, to hear the tape, to touch the cold steel that had carried a story too long silenced. Scarlett told the story every time, not as a headline, not as a legend, but as a truth. Slowly, carefully, like passing a torch. Because that's what it was. One Saturday morning, Scarlett found a letter in her mailbox. No return address, just her name, written in uneven ink. Inside was a photograph. 4 sailors, leaning against a Navy jeep, grinning like boys who thought the world would never change. Samuel Blake was one of them. On the back, scrawled in fading pen, were 7 words. "We didn't all disappear. You gave one of us back." Scarlett stood on her porch, the photo trembling in her hands, her chest aching with a grief and joy she couldn't separate. She whispered into the sea air, "You were never forgotten. Sam. Not anymore." That night, she took the patrol craft's restored wheel in her hands and set out onto the open road in her old truck. Rocky in the passenger seat, his ears flapping in the wind. She drove until the hills opened wide, until the stars blazed overhead like a million watchful eyes. At the ridgeline, Scarlett stopped. She stepped out, flag in her arms, the photograph tucked against her heart. She looked up at the sky and whispered, "I hope you see this. Sam, I hope you know we didn't let them win." The wind rose suddenly, rustling the pines around her, as if the world itself had answered back. And in that moment, Scarlett Rhodes did not feel like a mechanic. She felt like a soldier, carrying forward a legacy not written in medals or parades, but in truth, courage, and a warship that was never just a warship. A vessel of memory, a vessel of justice, a vessel of hope. That night, headlights appeared once more at the edge of her driveway, a black SUV, silent, waiting. But Scarlett didn't retreat. She didn't tremble. She stepped onto her porch, arms crossed, Rocky at her side. 2 men got out, not in suits this time, not polished. They looked tired, angry, cornered. "You don't know what you've started," one of them growled. Scarlett's voice was steel. "No, I know exactly what I've started." Headlights appeared behind them, 3 more vehicles pulling in, unmarked but purposeful. Veterans, investigators, allies. For the first time, the hunters realized they weren't in control. And as they turned to leave, Scarlett stood taller, the flag in her arms, the stars overhead. They weren't hunting her anymore. They were running. Anyone can uncover the truth if they're stubborn enough to dig and brave enough not to look away. Scarlett Rhodes never set out to be a hero. She wasn't trained for battles or ceremonies. She was just a mechanic, a woman who knew the language of steel and engines. Yet when the ocean revealed its secret, she refused to turn away. Scarlett's journey reminds us that history is not just written in textbooks or carved on monuments. It is hidden in the forgotten, the buried, and the voices that were silenced too soon. And sometimes, it takes an ordinary person with grease-stained hands to carry that truth back into the light. The folded flag, the warship's wheel, and the sailor's journal weren't just relics, they were proof that no lie can stay buried forever. Scarlett showed us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Because the truth is never the end. It's where everything begins. The end. Up next, 2 more unforgettable stories are waiting for you. Click to keep uncovering the hidden heroes among us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe some stories deserve to be told. No matter how long they've been buried,